not want to be in the recording, you can shut your camera off. I'm mainly just going to share it with people that signed up, so it's definitely not going to go out to a wide viewing audience, but I am going to record it. But other than that, welcome and thanks for showing up for historical newspaper research. My name is Alex Boucher. I work here at Gorgas Library. I'm a research and instructional services librarian, and we all have liaison areas as research librarians. And mine are that I'm the research librarian for the College of Human and Environmental Sciences, the Department of History, and the Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies program. So with historical newspaper research, mostly what I do is work with history students on this. So as the research librarian for history, I spend a lot of time helping students with newspaper research. So that will sort of inform what we talk about today. As far as the Zoom and what we are planning on doing today, like I mentioned, it's going to be recorded, and I will be sending out a copy of it to everyone that signed up, so you can go back and look at it if you have any questions. During the course of this, you can ask a question at any time, and that could mean a couple of different things. You can put it in the chat, or you could just unmute yourself and ask. So if I am saying something that's not making a lot of sense, or if I'm going too fast, or if you just have a question about something that we covered, please don't hesitate to ask questions. I will say though, there will be set aside time toward the end for a lot of questions. So if it's sort of like a general thing, just for like flow and continuity, maybe it'd be easiest just to ask it then, but don't hesitate if something I'm saying is confusing you. So that's mainly it with Zoom. And as far as what we'll cover, I think of this as sort of from the bottom up with historical newspaper research. So what I'm going to show you is how to kind of find and access our newspaper databases. I'll give you a sense of the scope and variety of our historical newspaper coverage. We'll talk about how to find and access individual newspapers. So not necessarily a newspaper database, but just if you're looking for one specific title, what are the easiest ways to do that? We'll talk about some basic newspaper database search tips, and then how to locate newspapers that the UA libraries may not have access to. So that can mean a couple of things, maybe digitized newspapers that are freely available on Google, but also maybe harder to find newspapers, historical newspapers that maybe even haven't been digitized, how to find those at other libraries and how to use them and access them. So that's the general gist of what we're going to be covering. Again, if at any point you don't see my screen, or if you trouble to hear me, or if you just have a question, definitely stop me. I am mainly going to go with slides and screenshots for this workshop because I did a class the other day on Zoom and the UA internet kind of came and went, so I don't have to deal with that again. But we're going to start with kind of the basics. What do we offer as a library and how to find those newspaper databases? Looks like we have somebody coming in, so I'll go ahead and let them in. So yes, if we're kind of just getting started, like I was mentioning to the other people, ask a question at any point if you want to. We are kind of starting at the beginning, which is how to find our newspaper databases, and then we will move on from there to kind of more expanded things such as search tips, how to locate newspapers that we don't have access to, that sort of thing. So how to find our newspaper databases. If you want to look for any of our historical newspaper databases at the UA libraries, the best place to go generally is the databases page. As you can see, this is just the library's website, which is lib.ua.edu. And the databases link is in sort of the middle of the page. If you prefer to go from MyBama, the library tab on MyBama, you'll see the databases link right below the Scout search as the first link in the quick links bar. But this is where most of our stuff is. So if you get to this databases page, it can be a little overwhelming because we have 600 databases. Not all of these are history databases. Definitely not all of these are newspaper databases. So how do you go about finding those databases on this page? There are a couple of things you can do. One, you could just do a search of some sort in the top right-hand corner. You could search for newspapers and you'll come up with 65 databases. You could search for a specific newspaper database like Proquest Historical Newspapers. You could search for a type of newspaper database like African American newspapers. This is one option as far as kind of getting into what we're actually looking for. Another is to click on the types filter at the top of the databases page. If you do that, you will see there is one just for newspapers. So if you click on that, it will just give you 60 newspapers. Now this can be a little, we probably have more than 60 newspaper databases, although it's right around there. But this is definitely one way of doing it in conjunction with searching for something like newspapers. The other thing that we can offer is we actually have a research guide. And I am going to actually go away from full screen for 1 second so I can copy the link to this research guide, which I'm about to show y'all on the PowerPoint. So we have a research guide just for historical newspaper databases. Our research guides are kind of right by the databases link on the library's website or on MyBama. So if you click on research guides, you'll get here, and you could find it by clicking on history or searching historical newspapers. But this is what it is. I'm going to post a link to it in the chat here. What this is something that I have created that can help basically as a way of compiling newspaper databases that we have, and also search tips and things like that. So what is specifically on here? One, we have tutorials, video tutorials for things like how to find individual newspaper titles. We have tutorials on how to find newspaper databases. So some of the similar stuff as we'll be covering today. But then we also have just collections of historical newspaper databases. And it's broken up into historical newspaper databases for the United States and historical newspaper databases for everything else, basically, international newspapers. Now, this is not everything out there, basically, but it's a pretty good sample. In this case, you'll see it's broken down into library databases, things you will need a MyBama login for, and freely available databases, things that have been digitized and put on Google, and there's an ever increasing amount of those specific things. And I'll talk a little bit about how to find those. Probably the biggest freely available American historical newspaper database is Chronicling America, which is from the Library of Congress, but there are plenty of other ones. The one for international we'll come back to, but it's very similar. Library databases, freely available databases. One thing I'll point out again when I talk about international historical newspaper databases is it's definitely, there's more British historical newspaper databases than any other type, at least that we have provide access to. But there are plenty of freely available databases, usually from a sort of national library. Like, for example, in France, it's Gallica. Germany has a German national library with a newspaper collection. Basically, they're out there and they're findable on Google. And then finally on here, just a couple of quick tutorials about individual newspaper databases. Probably the two biggest American newspaper databases we have, which are Proquest Historical Newspapers and newspapers.com. That's sort of a segue into what do we have? What do we provide access to as far as historical newspaper databases? Again, going off this guide because it's kind of an easy landing page for this. With historical newspaper databases in the United States, we have a lot of different things, but the two most widely used databases we have, and the sort of biggest ones, are Proquest Historical Newspapers and newspapers.com. And the good thing about the two of those are they are very complementary as far as what their content is. Proquest Historical Newspapers is where you would go if you were looking for any of the big national newspapers. So think New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, etc. And mostly we're talking about from the mid-19th century through the end of the 20th century. There's a continuation of this database just called Proquest Newspapers, which has a lot of the same newspaper titles just from like 2000 through the current day. You can also find that on our databases page. But this example is just New York Times, and we have it basically from 1857 through, this says 2017. I thought that was more of Proquest Newspapers coverage, but it goes to at least the end of the 2000s. Newspapers.com is complementary because while it has bigger city, relatively large newspapers, like, for example, you'll see here, Oakland Tribune, it also has a lot of smaller, regional, local newspapers. So as an example, I've just gone on newspapers.com and clicked on papers up in the top left. This is a fairly easy way of searching for what they have, and I've just typed in Tuscaloosa. And you will see a little bit of everything. You will see papers old enough to be Tuscaloosa with a K instead of a C. You'll see the Tuscaloosa News. You'll see papers going back all the way to the 1830s. And you can find all sorts of small town papers on here. If you want to do Black Belt, Alabama historical newspaper research, you can do it. And you would do it on newspapers.com. Going back, it just sort of depends on what you're looking for and what your topic is. If you're doing colonial America, you would look at something like early American newspapers. But we also have plenty of African American newspaper databases, as you can see a couple of them here. We have the Nation Archive. And looking again at African American newspapers, you could also on the databases page just search for that. So we have all sorts of different types of historical newspaper databases, but the two biggest are Proquest Historical Newspapers and then newspapers.com. As far as we mentioned earlier, freely available databases, like I mentioned, the biggest one is Chronicling America. This is a shot of it. You can just get on Google. Anyone can access this. This is not a library database. It's from the Library of Congress, and it is very good. If you can see, it says basically 1777 through 1963. My experience is it's really mostly strong for the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century through early 20th century. But you can also find plenty of other freely available newspaper databases just on Google. You can do it in a number of ways. In this case, I've searched for Utah historic newspapers. Maybe for some reason I'm researching Utah. I need to find something. It's not all on our databases. I have done one other thing here, which is I've done what's called like a site search, site:/.edu. That just makes it so it's all .edu sites. And the reason to do that in this case is a lot of the digitized newspapers come from universities and more specifically university archives. So they are hosted on .edu sites. You don't necessarily have to do that, or you could try that and then try just a normal Google search. In this case, you can see something like Utah digital newspapers. These things are popping up more and more all the time. So not everything has to be a bought and paid for library database. A lot of things are states are doing consortiums, universities are doing collections, etc. Just to kind of wrap up what we have, the international databases, like I mentioned, mostly we're talking the strength are British newspapers, but there are other kinds. One thing I would point out, if you're doing international newspaper research, or especially British newspaper research, a vaguely titled database like Gale Primary Sources is actually very good. So if you click on this, you'll see it's a lot more than it sounds like. So it's important to kind of check a database out and see what it is, because in this case, you'll see things like the Financial Times Historical Archive. You'll see British Library newspapers, 17th and 18th century Burney newspapers, the Economist Historical Archive, the Times, which is the Times of London Digital Archive, which is 1785 through 1985. So in this one kind of generically named database called Gale Primary Sources is actually a lot of stuff. So those are sort of how to find our databases and what we have to some extent, and what is available outside of what we provide. So what if you want to just find a single newspaper? You're not necessarily trying to do research in a big database because your research is focused on one town or one newspaper. How do you go about doing that? You can go on a database. Usually, like with Proquest Historical Newspapers, they'll have a link for publications and you can search for that. But it's not the quickest way of finding out if we have access to something, because we have a lot of different newspaper databases, so you don't want to have to search each of those to see if we have access to a specific paper. So the easiest way to do that is to go through a couple of R search engines, namely Scout or the library's catalog. They do similar things. It's really just what you're most comfortable with or what you're most familiar with. On Scout, let's say I want to find out if the University of Alabama provides digital access or maybe microfilm access to the Miami Herald. I could go on Scout, I could put it in, I could put quotations around it if I want to. That kind of makes it look for it as a phrase. I've changed the search field up there that says title. Naturally, it's on keyword, so I've changed it to title. This is what you'll see on Scout. You'll see, okay, do we have it as a digital resource? In this case, you'll see that yes, we do, but it looks like we only do from 1982 through the present. So that's important to know. The second link is for something called the Center for Research Libraries. The Center for Research Libraries is a big national consortium that we're a member of that can provide digital access in some cases, but in a lot of times it can provide microfilm access. And because we are a member, we can get the microfilm for you for free and very quickly. And then you might see, like at the bottom, that we actually have some of the microfilm. If you aren't familiar with microfilm, to access microfilm, to look at it, you have to have a microfilm reader, which we do. And microfilm is struggling for an explanation. If you haven't used microfilm before, it's basically like a camera reel of pictures. In this case, pictures of newspaper pages. And you just sort of scroll through it and you look at the individual pictures. It's not really searchable in a kind of keyword sense, but in some cases, it's the only option. And when it's the only option, it's because that newspaper hasn't been digitized and made available either as an internet resource or a library database. The library's catalog is a similar thing. I'm searching here for Tuscaloosa News. The only thing I've done here, if you see next to the search bar, you'll see it's a journal title. There, I think the default is something like keyword or something like that. You could change it to title or journal title. Either one would work. And searching for Tuscaloosa News, what you'd see is a couple of things. One, we have it as an electronic resource for some periods of time. We also have literally some print copies of it at the University Library Archives. And then you'll see microfilm, and then you'll see some kind of similarly named newspapers. The only exception to this, when the best way to find individual newspapers is to go to Scout or Library's catalog, because it'll search our databases. It seems to me that it does not pick up newspapers.com. So if you search Scout, the library's catalog, you might also search newspapers.com. In this case, the way you do it, if you can see on this screenshot up the top of the page, there's a link for papers. And then you can just search for a newspaper title, or like in this case, you can search for a city, Salt Lake City, for example. And it will just show you what they have, and you can access the papers there. So that is a fair amount as far as how to find our databases, how to find individual newspapers, what we have, what is available online. So I thought I would share a few search tips. We are not going to go super in depth on this. I'm not going to bore you for 20 or 30 minutes talking about how to search a newspaper database, but I will point out a couple of important things. With historical newspaper databases, there are certain things you need to keep your mind on. One, if there's an advanced search option, I would recommend that you use it. For example, here's Proquest Historical Newspapers. This is the basic search, which is just the kind of Google style single search bar. And single search bars work perfectly well for Google, but I don't find them quite as useful for a historical newspaper database. So instead, I would recommend the advanced search, and I'll show you that in a second. But always, in addition to that, always remember about the publication date slider. If you're doing historical newspaper research, you really want to drill down for a specific date or time range or something like that. So here's the advanced search on Proquest Historical Newspapers, and you'll see the publication date slider right below the search bars. There are various options for it. The most commonly used one would just be a specific date range. So you could look for, a week, or you could look for a decade. It just depends on what you are researching and what you're interested in. Be careful with your search terms and terminology. And this is the whole ball game with searching historical newspaper databases. And what I mean by this is you really want to avoid using anachronistic search terms. So you really want to kind of think of like, what would the terms have been during the historical period that you're looking at? What sort of words would have been used to describe a place, an event, people, etc. So sometimes when I'm showing a class of undergraduates, I will show them a sort of silly example of this. This is on Proquest Historical Newspapers. So I'm looking at 1914 through 1918, and I've searched for World War I. I put it in quotations so it looks for the exact phrase, et cetera, et cetera. And if you click search, you find almost nothing. Usually after about 10 seconds, one of the students will figure out why it comes up with almost nothing. And that's because no one referred to World War I as World War I between 1914 and 1918. It simply just wasn't called that. So sort of a silly example, but it gets to the point of really making sure that you're cognizant of what the search terms, what the terminology for something would have been during the time that you're researching. So for this case, it only finds 117 results. If you just put in something like the war or the Great War, you find 445,000 results. So that just means kind of keeping track of what you would have been looking at. Also, it can lead to, you just need to be cognizant of the time period. If you're researching Native American history in the 19th century, you probably wouldn't use Native American as a search term much because it just wouldn't have been used in a 19th century newspaper. You want to think of like, what would the titles of the articles have been? What would the words in an article have been? And that's really what you're searching for, because these search engines just search for words. That's really all they do. Finally, just learn the database mechanics and explore the search filters. I have another search here. Let's say I'm a history student. I am looking at left-wing groups in Guatemala in 1953, right before the sort of CIA-inspired coup in 1954. I've searched for Guatemala, and all of these search engines use what are called Boolean operators. The most common one, the default one, is and. You can see the and right by each of the search bars, and that's just to combine search terms, so like Guatemala and communists. But you can also use things like the Boolean operator or to search for related terms. Now here I've used another term that sounds silly now, reds, but that was actually a term that would have been used in 1953 newspapers to describe communists or socialists or things like that. So I'm looking for a number of different terms there, but going beyond that, the databases also have other mechanics. So what you'll see on the right-hand side are the search fields. So the default for that is usually anywhere. So what that means is it's searching for the word Guatemala anywhere. It's searching for it in the title of an article. It's searching for it in the full text of an article. It's searching for it in what's called the metadata of the article, anywhere. But if you want to really drill down, like if you're getting too many results, or if you're getting results that aren't quite relevant, you could use one of these different search fields. Like for example, document title. If you want Guatemala in the title of every article that comes back, you can do that. You can get publication title, document text, etc. And then on the search page, this is the search page for this search that I did. As you can see, you will see weird terms like, well, not weird at the time, but terms like reds, things like that. There are other options on the left-hand side. So you can search for a specific newspaper. Like, okay, I've done this search, but all I really care about is New York Times because I'm doing a specific study of how this one newspaper covered this event. You could just click on New York Times and that gets rid of every other article. You can also do article types. Like in this case, you'll see you could look for an article, a front page article, or an editorial. And really, there are even more options for that back on the main advanced search screen. If you'll see below the publication date sliders, you'll see document types, and I've just got a quick screenshot of it, but there are a lot of types in here. So you could search for letters to the editor. You could search for political cartoons. You could search for front page articles. You could search for all sorts of things. So the last thing to think about that as far as learning the mechanics is that all of these databases have some sort of help document or tutorials. If you'll see with Proquest Historical Newspapers, it's up in the upper right-hand side, and that can just give you some examples of things to look out for. Let me check the chat real quick. Okay, that's fine. So you will find a help document and things like that. On newspapers.com, you'll see it on the left-hand side of the front page. There's usually some sort of tutorial, some sort of help document, which will just kind of give you a sense of some tips for searching, things like that. All right, so the very last section of this workshop, I'm going to talk briefly about how to find newspapers and access newspapers that we don't have, or that you cannot find digitally on Google. One way of looking to see what newspapers were from a certain area is just to go on Google. And in this case, I've done what's called, again, a site search. And a good site search to do is the loc.gov, the Library of Congress. So I've searched for Tuscaloosa newspapers, and it will just give you a pretty comprehensive list of any newspaper that's coming from the Tuscaloosa area, going back a long time, basically. You'll see another example. If you click on one of the links, just give you a sense of what's out there. So if you're trying to find what is available for a certain area, I would probably start with Google and go from there. But then how do you access them? If they haven't been digitized, if they're not in a database, if you can't find them that way, how do you go about finding it and accessing it? Well, what you would most likely do, the way you would be accessing is accessing it through what we mentioned earlier, microfilm. And the easiest way to find that is to go to a database called WorldCat. There's a link to it on this research guide. You can also find it on our databases page. But WorldCat is basically every library's catalog rolled into one search engine. So it's great for finding books, but also good for finding newspapers. So in this case, I have run across some very small, sort of obscure Baptist newspaper called the Biblical Recorder, but that's my research project. I'm writing about Baptist newspapers. I want to see if I can access this, if it's out there. So I could go on WorldCat, go to the title search, put it in. And this page will look a little bit overwhelming or confusing if you've never seen it before, but if you kind of just slowly go through it, you'll see what they're saying. Basically, so the first option, that looks like, to me, it's the actual newspaper. So again, like archives will have physical editions of this newspaper. Maybe scroll through, the fourth one looks like the same thing, basically. What you would be looking for most likely, though, as a student in Tuscaloosa, if you can't access it through the internet, is microfilm. So the fifth link is the microfilm link. You can see what libraries own the microfilm of this newspaper. In this case, you would see that actually Samford has a lot of editions of it, 1843 through 1940. You will want to make sure to actually look at that, because like if you see down at the very bottom, the last college that has it only has it for like 8 or 9 years. So Samford has it. What does that mean? One, I guess you could just drive to Samford and look at the microfilm at their library, or you could access it through what we have, which is Interlibrary Loan. This is just the page for Samford's record of they have it from 1842 through 1867 and then 1870 through 1940. But to get this, if you aren't willing to drive to Samford, you would submit an interlibrary loan request. Interlibrary loan link is on the main page of the library. It's also on the My Bama Library tab page. You would have to fill out and create an interlibrary loan account if you don't have one, but you can request microfilm through this, and the library that owns it, if they're willing to send it to us, they will send it to us, and then you can access the microfilm and look at it here at the library. You don't have to worry about not knowing how to look at microfilm. When you come up here to get the microfilm, you can have one of our people show you how to use it, basically. Let's see, that is mainly what we are going to cover today. I did not want to spend an hour talking, and it looks like it's 12:35. That is in general what we are going to cover, but does anyone have any questions? Well, I'll tell you what, if no one has any questions, then that is pretty much all we have. Again, I put the link to the Historical Newspaper Research Guide in the chat, so I think that could be helpful to y'all. It also has my email address, so you can send me an email if you have any questions. I will follow up in maybe today, maybe tomorrow, with a link to this recording and also a link to the slides. But if no one has any questions, that's about all we have. Thank you for coming, and hopefully it was helpful.